Hey guys, welcome back to Coding Shorting with NJ. In this tutorial, we are going to learn to implement two-step verification-based login system. The way this login system works is that first the user enters username and password. If those two details have been verified to be correct, then the backend sends a particular code, which is called One Time Password, to the user either through SMS or an email. Once the user gets this OTP, it resends back that OTP to the backend, where it is verified if the user provided OTP matches with the one sent to him through email or SMS, then the user is finally logged in. And today we are going to learn how to implement exactly that logic. And before we jump into coding shorting, let me give you a demo of what we are going to implement today. So this is going to be the landing page of our project. Here the user is supposed to provide an email. Well, had this not been a proof of concept project, you would have been asked to provide password as well along with the email. But in order to keep the tutorial and the code shorter, I have just gone for the email only. Okay, before I enter any email which is registered with the backend, let me show you guys how it behaves if incorrect email has been provided or no email has been provided. So let's start with no email provided, but I click on this send OTP button. Now it says email cannot be empty and this message disappears after 3 seconds. Now let's put some random email and see what happens. You are not registered with us because this email is not registered, and if you notice, the error message disappeared after 3 seconds as well. Now let's start with the correct email address. So currently there is one email registered in the database, which is this email address. Now let me click on send OTP. Now I have been shown another form which is expecting an OTP from me. So I should have received an OTP in my mailbox with which I am registered with this website. So I need to go and check out my mailbox to see if I have received any OTP or not. But before doing that, let's click on submit without providing any OTP. Again, I get the error message, OTP cannot be empty. Now let's put some random values. It says incorrect OTP. Now let's go to our inbox and let me get the OTP from there. Now this is the email that I have received, which says your OTP to login is 3585. Now let's go back to our project and enter this OTP, 3585. Now I have been redirected to another page which is supposed to be my dashboard. Currently it doesn't have anything except some random lorem ipsum text and a logout button. Now this page, you can only see this page if you have successfully logged in. Let me log out and let's try to go back to same page again, which was dashboard.html. See, because I'm not currently logged in, the moment I entered that URL, I got redirected automatically back to our login page. So you can only view this dashboard page if you have successfully logged in. So this is the overall mini project which we are going to implement today. So let's start coding shorting. We are starting with an empty folder in our Visual Studio Code editor, and the first thing that we are going to do is create a folder in which we'll put all our front-end related files. So let's create 3 files, index.html, then script.js and style.css. Let's start with index.html and I'm generating skeleton code. Let's change the title. Now in the body, we basically are going to have just 3 elements, one h1 element and 2 divs. Within those 2 divs, we are going to create a form with only one input field. The first one is going to ask for email and the second one is going to ask for the OTP. And in the beginning, the display property of second div is going to be none, so that second div is not visible. Second div is only going to be visible once an email has been sent to the backend server for login process, and the login process has started. So let's start with heading OTP-based two-step login verification. Now let's create first div, and I'm going to assign it 2 classes. One is container and other is going to be email-container. So the reason for assigning 2 classes to this div is that the first class name container is going to be shared by our second div as well. This way, when we define styling for the container class, it's going to be applied to both of those divs. And the reason for having a second class name is that this div is going to be manipulated through JavaScript and the other div as well. So our JavaScript should be able to uniquely identify each div. Therefore, we need to have unique class names attached with those divs as well. Okay, now within this div, let's create a heading h2 which says enter email. Now let's create a form with again two classes, form and email form. The reason for having two class names for the form are the same that we had for our divs as well. With this class name form, we are going to define styling for this form and the form in the next div. However, with this class name, JavaScript is going to uniquely identify this form. Okay, and now within this form, we need an input field of type email. Let's give it a name email and ID email as well. Since we are not defining any label, so let's define a placeholder. Enter email. Now let's define a button and give it a class email submit. And the caption for this button should be send OTP. Because when we click on this button, a request is going to be sent to the server, which will in turn send us an OTP in our mailbox. But between this input field and button, we should have an empty span. Let's give it a class name email error. We are going to keep this span empty because all the error messages that we saw with the red text that appear only just for 3 seconds are going to be displayed in this span message. So when there is no error, obviously we don't want to see any text, red text there. That's why the contents of this span are going to be empty, and the JavaScript will dynamically define the text contents according to each error. So this is all the logic for our first div. We are going to have exactly the same logic for the second div as well. So I'm going to copy it. The only thing that I will do is that I'll change the class names and the type of input field as well. So instead of saying enter email, h2 should say enter OTP. And let's change the second class name from email container to OTP container. Email form to OTP form, and the type is going to be number because our OTP is going to be all digits. Let's change the name to OTP as well, and ID should be OTP as well, and the placeholder should be enter OTP. The class name for span should be OTP error, and the class name for the button should be OTP submit, and the caption should be finally login. So this is all our HTML. Now let's link our JavaScript and CSS files. So a script, and let's go up for the styling. So we are all set as far as our index.html is concerned. Now let's go and open this file in the live server so that we can check out how does it currently look. Okay, so this is how it currently looks. It needs styling, and since our main focus is not styling, so what I'm going to do is that I'm not going to make this CSS styling part of this tutorial. However, when I upload the code on GitHub, I will include that styling file there so that if you are interested in that styling, you can use that styling. But I want to keep this video's length shorter, and I don't want your focus to be distracted as well. That's why I'm skipping this part. So what I'm gonna do, I'm going to grab in the styling and put it in my style.css file, and then we'll start from there. Let's go and check. So why doesn't our button get the color? Oh, our button is supposed to have two classes as well, one for styling and one for JavaScript manipulation. So button class should also have one more class called btn, because this class defines the styling for our buttons. Now let's go and check one more time. Okay, now perfect. Okay. Now we need to work on our JavaScript logic. This JavaScript file is basically going to consist of 2 event listeners for each of those buttons in our forms, so that when we click on those buttons, a fetch request should be sent to the backend, our server. Beside those 2 event listeners, we are going to define a helper function which is going to display the error messages in our spawn HTML elements. But first of all, we need references to those HTML elements in our JavaScript file. So let's get started with those references. So let's first get a reference to the first div. We have given that div class name email container. Okay. Now we need reference to other div as well, which is OTP container. Now we need references to the buttons in those forms. And the unique class name for the button, the OTP button, was submit-OTP. So submit-OTP. Let's change this to submit OTP as well. Copy, paste, and submit email. Now let's get references to our spawn elements as well. The class name that we gave to the first spawn is email error. So copy, paste. The second one is going to be OTP error. And the class name is OTP-error. Okay. Now we have got the references. Now let's define the event listener for submit email. So submit email, add event listener, and the event listener is click. So let's pass the event to this arrow function which triggered this event, because using that event we are going to call prevent default method. The reason for calling this prevent default method is that because our buttons are inside the form, so when we click that button, the default behavior of the form is that the form will try to communicate with the server, which in turn redirects us to another page. So we want to stay on the same page, therefore we have to prevent the default behavior of the form. So that's why we needed to pass that event which triggered this, because this event actually contains the information about the form. Now we need to send a fetch request to our backend, and we have to send the email that the user has typed in the body of that fetch request. So that means the method that we are going to use is going to be post method, and the address is going to be backend folder. So we haven't yet created this folder, but we will create this folder when we define our backend logic. And within this backend folder, we will have a file called login.php. So we want to communicate with this file. And the second parameter to fetch is an object in which we will define all the attributes. So the most important attribute is going to be the method. We want to send this request as a post HTTP request. Now, the second most important attribute is going to be the body, because this body attribute is going to contain the data that the user has typed in the form. When a normal post request is sent directly from the form, all the data in the form's input fields is automatically made available in one of the PHP's global variables named $_post. But since we are not sending this request directly from the form, we are sending a fetch request. Therefore, the data in those input fields will not be automatically made available to PHP in that PHP_post global variable. So we have to make sure the data that the user has typed in the input fields must be made available into that global variables. To do that, we have to create an object of type form data. So we are going to say new form data, and we need to pass in the whole form to the constructor of this form data. This way, this form data will extract all the input fields data from that form. So document.querySelector, and the class name that we gave to form was email-form. Now the data in this form will be made available into PHP's $_post global variable. Okay. Now since this is a fetch request, so we will receive a promise. We haven't yet defined the backend logic, but the way we will define this backend logic is that our backend will always return a JSON object. Therefore, the first thing that we need to do is that we have to call a method called JSON, which will basically convert what we have received from the response stream into a JSON object. Then we need to call another then block because this JSON method will return us another promise. Now we can work on our object over here. So this response that we will receive from the server will consist of an object with only one attribute, which is going to be named status, and the value for that status is going to be either success or failure. The status will be set to success only if our backend looked up the email provided by the user into its database, and if a matching email address was found. In that case, our backend will send us this object with the status set to success. Otherwise, it will send that object with the status value set to failure. So we need to check if data.status equals success. If the status is equal to success, that means the server has also sent an OTP into our mailbox. So we have to make that other div made visible by setting its display property to block. And we need to make our first div disappear by setting its display property to null. If that is not the case, then obviously no matching email address that the user provided has been found in the database. In that case, we need to display an appropriate message in the spawn element. But let's work on the success part first. So we have to make the OTP container visible by setting OTP container dot style dot display set to block, and email container dot style dot display is set to none. That's it. That's all we need to do. And if the data.status is not equal to success, in that case, let's call the error method, which takes two parameters. The first one is going to be the spawn in which we want to display the message, and second one is going to be the message itself. So we want this message to be displayed in the email error spawn. So email error, and the message should be you are not registered with us. We need to define this function though. This is helper function. However, this is all the logic for our submit email event listener. We need a similar logic for the submit OTP email listener as well. Since the logic for the submit OTP is going to be almost similar to this one, so what I'm gonna do is that I'm copy this whole event listener, paste it over here, and let's start changing the names. So submit OTP event listener, event default. Again, we need to send a post fetch request, but this time our form data object is going to reference to OTP form. Then in the response, again the response we will receive from the backend will consist of an object with only one attribute status, whose value will be the success or failure. So if the value is successful, in that case, we would like our user to be redirected to dashboard. Otherwise, we will display the appropriate error. So let's work on the success part. Let's remove this. And since we want the user to be redirected to the dashboard page, so window.location.replace. And we want this to be frontend/dashboard.html. If that is not the case, we need to send an error message, but this time the spawn is going to be OTP error, and the message should be invalid or incorrect OTP provided. Okay, now let's work on our error function. It takes two parameters. The first one is going to be a reference to one of the spawn elements, and the second one is going to be message. So let's set the text contents of the spawn to whatever message we have received. Then we need to set text color to be red, and next we need it to disappear after 3 seconds. So set timeout. Now this timeout takes two parameters. The first one is going to be a function, a callback function that is executed after a certain time, and that certain time is defined in the second parameter. Since our function is going to be just one-liner code, so we are going to define an arrow function. So I am setting the text content back to none, and I want this arrow function to be executed after 3 seconds. So I'm putting value 3000 means after 3000 milliseconds. So this is all the logic for our JavaScript. We have to yet define a file named dashboard.html because this is where we will be redirected in case of successful login. So let's create this file. So for the time being, I'm only defining h1 there. Once we have defined our backend logic, we will get back to this file again and define further logic in it. But for the time being, we should have a file. Okay. Now let's go and verify what we have done so far. Okay, since there is no backend, so obviously we cannot send a fetch request to the backend. The only thing that we can check so far is that if we click on the send OTP button without entering anything over here in the input field, we should get an error message displayed over here that the email cannot be empty. Actually, I haven't defined this part, so obviously it won't work. Okay, so let's go back to the script file, and so after prevent default, we need to put a check. Now what this check will do, it will make sure that there is some data in the input field. If there is no data, it will display the appropriate message in the spawn, and it will terminate this event listener right there. Because if this event listener is not terminated right there, the next thing is a fetch request to the server, and we don't want to make any request to the server if the user has not entered any email or any OTP in the input boxes. So since we are working on the submit OTP, so that means we need to check if that input field is empty or not. So if document query selector, we need a reference to the input field, and since we haven't given any class names to input fields, we have only given IDs to those input fields. So we are interested in an input field with an ID OTP, and if its value is equal to empty, in that case send an error message or call error function. And which spawn we want to target? We want to target the spawn which is in the OTP form. So OTP error, and the message should be OTP cannot be empty. Let's make it OTP field. And then we want to return, because if we don't return, the next thing will be execution of this fetch request. So we want this fetch request to be executed if our input field is empty. So we need exactly similar logic for our submit email event listener as well. So let me put it over here after prevent default. Now all we need to do is change from OTP to email because our input field has this ID. Now this time when we are calling the error function, the spawn that we should target is email error, and the message should be email field cannot be empty, and then we return. Okay, now let's go and check out the logic. Refresh, send OTP, nothing happened. Cannot read properties of null, add event listener on line 8. Class name is submit-email. Let's go and check our index.html if this is the exact name that we have given to our submit button. Email-submit. Okay, it's email-submit, not submit-email. Paste. Let's go and check the other button. OTP-submit. OTP-submit. Okay, I hope everything is fine. Now let's go and verify. Email field cannot be empty. Okay, so it's working so far. Now let's go back and work on our backend. Okay, so let's start our backend logic by creating a folder for backend. Okay guys, it turns out all these files are outside the front-end folder. We need to get them inside the front-end folder. Okay. Now let's create a backend folder. Within this backend folder, we need two files. One is going to be login.php, which is our main file. The second one is going to contain our connectivity with the database. Let's call it db.php. So before we start any coding, let's go and have a look at our database. The database that we are using is called OTP_login, and it basically contains only one table named user, which has basically two fields, an email and OTP. Okay, that's it. And currently it contains only one row of data with my email address. So that's all the database that we needed. It's a very minimalistic database. Now let's go and define our connectivity with this database. So we are going to store that connectivity in a variable named connection, new MySQLi. So it takes 4 parameters. First one is going to be the URL, or where our server is running, the database server. So it's localhost and port is 3306, the default port for MySQL server. And since it's default, you can skip it if you like. I tend to put it there so that I always remember it's a different server running somewhere else. Then the username, which is root in my case, and the password is root as well. Then the name of the actual database with which you want to connect, which was OTP_login, semicolon. Now we just need to check if we have actually been able to connect with the database. Otherwise, send an appropriate message and terminate the program right there. So if connection connect_error number. So if there is any error number, that means something did go wrong and we were not able to connect with the database server. So send this response back to the user, JSON encode, because we want to send JSON data back to the client. And let's get its status. Let's simply pass the error message. Then exit the program right there. If that is not the case, the connection is there and we can utilize this connection to make further queries with the database. Now let's go and work on the login.php file. So before I start any more coding in this file, we are going to download a package named PHPMailer because we are going to send the OTP to the user in his or her registered email mailbox. So we need to be able to send an email address to the user through this PHP program. So for that we need to install a package named PHPMailer. Okay, I have opened my terminal window and currently I am at the root folder, that is OTP-based login. So I need to go into this backend folder because this is where I want to install the PHPMailer. I don't want this PHPMailer to be downloaded in the top level or root folder because this way it will be accessible to the front end as well. And since it has nothing to do with front end, That's why I want to be installed in the backend folder, because that's its appropriate place. So cd backend. Okay, now I'm inside the backend folder. Now I'm going to use command composer require PHPMailer / PHPMailer. Okay, now the package has been downloaded. As you can see, we have got a new folder in our backend folder named vendor and 2 composer files. So let's get out of this backend folder. So cd ... So we are back into our root folder. Now let's start coding in our login.php file. In order to use PHP folder eventually in this program, we need to import certain packages. And importing a package should be the very first thing. Therefore, let's start with that. PHPMailer, then use exceptions class and SMTP, because we will be using SMTP server to send email addresses to our users. Now let's include our database connectivity file with this program. So require database.php. We also need another file which is in vendor folder, and it's called autoload.php. This autoload.php is going to handle everything which has anything to do with PHPMailer classes. Now since this project is about login process, so that means our server, our login.php file, should remember between different client requests. So it should retain data about the user who is logging in. So that means we must have sessions in our program. So I'm going to call session start function so that session gets started. Now if you remember, each of the fetch requests that we have created in script.js file, both of them are actually post requests. So we need to check if the request that received, if the request method is post, then we should start executing the code which is going to be defined in those curly brackets. But now since both of the requests that come from the client are going to be post requests, so how will our server is going to distinguish whether it is a request to send OTP or whether it is a request with the OTP? That means our server need to be able to distinguish between those two requests coming from the server. So we know that if it is the very first request, so that means its post data is going to contain an input field which is named email. And if it's the second request from the user, then it has an input field which is named OTP. So that means we should have and let's define another check, which is we want to see if this request method has a variable set, and that variable is called post, and within this post the name is going to be email. So if the post global variable of PHP contains a variable named email, so that means it's the very first request from the user. However, if it's a second request, then it's going to be something like that. The request method is going to be post, but the $_post global variable will have a field with the name OTP. So this is how the server is going to distinguish between which request has come in and how to proceed further. So let's start with the very first request. Let me comment request from client with email address, and this one is request from client with OTP code. So let's start working on the very first request, which is the user has sent an email address. So what we need to do over here is that we need to connect with the database, check if a matching email address is found in our database. If that is the case, then generate a random OTP, store that OTP into the database and send that OTP as an email to the user's mailbox, and send a success reply back to the fetch. And if the matching email address is not found in the database, then send reply back to the fetch with status set to failure. So to do that, let's extract this data and post global variable into our local variable email. Okay, since this data is going to be received from the user, so we need to sanitize it. Therefore, we are going to pass this data to a function called real escape string, which is provided by this connection object. Now let's connect with the database and search for this email address. So let's execute a query, select everything from user. Well, user is a table name in the database, where email equals $email. Since this query is going to return us a result set, so I'm going to store it in a result variable. Now if any result set has been returned from this query at all, that means we have found at least one row with the matching email address. So in order to check that, if result num rows, so if there is any data in this num rows, that means the matching email has been found. So in that case, let's create a session variable. Let's call it email, and in that session variable we are going to store the current email address that we have received from the user. Now generate an OTP. So I'm going to store it in a variable named OTP, and to generate a random OTP I'm going to call a function called rand, and I want it to be 4-digit OTP. So 4 parameters or 4-digit number for the first parameter of the random, and the second one is also going to be 4 digits. So this random function is going to generate 4-digit code which will consist of digits between 1 and 9. That means 0 will not be the part of this OTP code. Now we need to update this user's row in the database as well with the latest OTP. So connection query, let's put double quotations because we are going to use in string interpolation. Update user, set OTP equals $OTP, where email equals $email. Next, we need to send this OTP as an email to the user as well. So to send this OTP as an email to the user, I'm going to call a function called send email. So we need to define this function yet because this is not a built-in function. This function send email is going to take 2 parameters from us. The first one is going to be the email to which the email is going to be sent, and the second parameter is the OTP which will be sent in that email. Now since this is not a built-in function, so it's complaining. So let's go down and let's define an empty send email function for the time being. It takes 2 parameters, email and OTP. Let's leave it empty for the time being. Now let's go up. So after sending the email to the user, now send the reply back to the fetch API. So if we are inside this if block, so that means everything has gone successfully. We have found a matching email. So in that case, we want the message that we send to the user is success message. So JSON_encode, and it takes an array, an associative array. Status is success. So this will be an indication to the front end that everything has gone smoothly and front end can proceed further. Now if we are outside the if, in that case the message should be same message but status set to failure. And then at the very end, let's exit out of this whole first part. Okay, Now let's work on if we have received an OTP from the user. In that case, the first thing that we need to do is that we have to extract this data in local variable and sanitize as well. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go up and copy this line, paste it, and since it's OTP in this case, so let's change the name to OTP as well for the local variable. Okay. Now basically after receiving this OTP, we need to again connect with the database and verify if the OTP is stored with this user email and the one provided by the user, this one, let's name it user provided OTP. So if this OTP, user provided OTP, and the one is stored in the database with the matching email, if those two OTPs match, if they match, that means the user can finally log in. So we need to execute a query. The query is going to be select everything from user where OTP equals user provided OTP and email equals, so against which email address row this OTP should be checked. So that means we should have an email address of the user which had made this request, the first one, and to whom we send the OTP. So where can we get that email address from? Because from the user we have only received OTP this time. Since we stored the email address in the session variable, so our session contains this email address. So let's extract that email address from the session variable, $_ session, and the variable name is email, all capital. Okay. Now we can provide where OTP equals user provided OTP and email equals $email. Since it's a varchar, so it should be within single quotations, semicolon. Let me close this. Okay. Now again this will return us a result set, so let's store it in a variable named result. Now if result num rows, so if some rows has been returned, this will return as true. In that case we need to create another session variable. Let's name it logged in and set it to true. This indicates the user has properly logged in. He has gone through both of those verification steps successfully and now he is a logged in user. Now send the same message, status equals success, else send status equals failure, and then finally exit. Okay. Now let's work on our send email function. So we are using PHPMailer to give our PHP program the capability to log into our email account pretending to be us, I mean whoever's email credentials are provided, pretending to be that person. From there, this PHP program will create an email and send it to the user who's trying to log in. I have already created a tutorial in which I have explained in detail how to send an email using this PHPMailer. If you are interested, I'll put the link in the description down below and I'll put the card up there. Please go and check it out that later. In this tutorial, therefore, I'll just quickly explain the basic things. I won't delve into details. So the first thing is that we need to create an object of type PHPMailer. If we want to receive exceptions, we need to pass true to it. Now we have an object of type PHPMailer, and at the very end, when we actually want to send an email, we will call a method called mail on this object. But before that, we have to set certain attributes of this object. So let's define those attributes by creating a try-catch block, because we can get exceptions. So let's just simply return the exception that we receive. Okay, within this try block, we will be setting those attributes first, and then we will finally call the method send after setting all those attributes. So to set the attribute, let me copy paste this multiple times because there are quite a few attributes that we need to set. The first attribute is going to be a method called SMTP because we want to use SMTP server through which we will be sending this email. Then we have to provide the host. We are going to use smtp.gmail.com. So basically the SMTP server that we will be using is going to be Gmail account. So their SMTP server's host name we are supposed to provide, which is smtp.gmail.com. Then we need to provide username. So I'm going to use my account. And password. So I'm keeping this thing currently ... I will insert this password at the end. Otherwise I will have to continuously blur this part, which is going to take a lot of effort at the time of editing. So I'm not putting this for the time being. Now we have to set SMTP authentication to true. So basically what this username and password is going to do is that this PHP program login.php is going to log into this account pretending to be me. Once this login.php program is logged in there, then it will create an email address and send it to the user who is trying to log in into our project. So here it's saying if SMTP authentication is required, which is yes, true, which is set to true. Now we need to provide the port of that SMTP server, which is 587. Then the second property is SMTP secure, and here basically you have to provide the transmission security protocol. So TLS, we want to use TLS, transmission layer security. Now the next attribute is set from. So here you will provide the email address, which will be displayed in the email address as the sender of this email to our actual user who is going to receive this email. So our recipient will think that this email has come from whatever email you provide over here. So you can provide a different email over here if you like, but the thing is this, Gmail does not allow you to provide a different email address. So even if you provide a different email address over here, the recipient will still see this email address. So that's the thing with Gmail. It's not any kind of error or PHPMailer's fault. And the next parameter, which is optional, so whatever name you provide over here is going to be displayed as the sender of the email. So this will work. So let me write coding with NJ as the name that should be displayed to the recipient. The next is who should this email address go to. That means who is the recipient. For that we have to use an attribute called add address, and let's provide the email address of the user who is trying to log in. We need few more attributes. Next we have to define if the email that we are sending, is it a HTML email or simple text. So is HTML, we have to set it to true. Nowadays which email isn't HTML email. Then we have to define the subject. So this is going to be displayed as the subject of the email. So your OTP code is the subject. Then comes the body, which is going to be HTML. So let's say here is your OTP code, line break, and then $sign OTP. We don't need this. Now finally we can actually send the email by calling the send method. Okay, that's all the logic so far for our backend. We yet have to define the logic for logout, but first let's test out the code so far. So we need to start the server first. I'm going to start it at port 9000. Okay, now let's go there. Let's go to frontend.index.html and let's try it out. We have already tried the empty email cannot be empty. Okay, now let's try some random value. You are not registered with us, it's working. Okay, now let's try the registered one. So now we have come across our second div. It's expecting an OTP, so let's go and check our inbox. The code is 6329. Let's enter 6329 and we have been successfully redirected to dashboard. So that means our second logic is also working properly. Now all we need to do is we have to define the logout logic over here. We need a button on this page. When we click on that, we should be logged out. Besides that piece of logic, the other piece of logic that we want to implement is that we should only be able to see this page if we are actually logged in. If we are not logged in, we should immediately be redirected back to index.html page. So let's go and work on that part. So dashboard. Besides this h1, let's use a paragraph and lorem, let's say 15. So it's some text. Now let's create a button. Let's give it a class btn and logout. Caption should be logout as well. So let's link our same style file so that it looks relatively decent. Refresh. Okay, now we need to define the logic for this logout page, as well as we should immediately be redirected back to index.html if we are not logged in. So let's go and work on first that part. So we are defining the script in the same file. Now let's send a fetch request again to the same login file. And this time we are not sending any data, it's just a simple get request. We don't need curly brackets. So let's define the then block. Another then block. Now again it will check if data.status equals success. Let's make it if status not equal to success, that means we are not logged in. In that case, we should immediately be redirected back to index.html. So window dot location dot replace front end index.html. If not, we will stay on the same page, so nothing will happen. This should be backend. Okay, now we need to define its complementing part at the back end. So let's go back to login.php. So before this function, let's define if $_server request method equals get, then following should happen. So we will check if this session variable logged in, if it's set to true, then we are logged in and it's okay to display the dashboard. Otherwise the user should be redirected back. So if is set $_session logged in. So if this variable is set, then echo success, else send the failure message and then exit. Okay, since we are logged in, so obviously we won't be able to verify if we are being logged out. So what I'm gonna do, so let me put if data status not equal to success 1, then we should be redirected. Now since we will get the status success and we are checking against if it's success 1 or not, so we should be redirected this time. Okay, so that means our first part is working properly. Now let me go back and remove this one, and this, let me comment this out. I put it there just to troubleshoot the problem. Now the only thing left is this logic for logout button. So when we click on this logout button, we should be logged out. So we need to send another fetch request, but only when the logout button is clicked. So first of all, let's get reference to this logout button. And what class name have we given to this button? Logout. Let's make it shorter as well. Logout.add event listener. Let's click. Let's copy this fetch request, paste it over here. So we are making exactly the same fetch request. Okay, and if we are successfully logged out, we want again to be redirected back to the index.html page. But now the problem is this: the first request was supposed to verify if the user is logged in or not, and the second one should actually log out the user. But if we are sending exactly same request to the server is going to be confused. So we need to somehow distinguish between these two requests. So what we are going to do is that we are going to attach a query parameter to the second request, which is the actual logout, so that the URL is different, and the server has a parameter in $_get global variable, and based on that the server will identify that it's actually a logout request. So to attach a query request, first of all append a question mark at the end, and then we need to append an object of type URL search params. So new URL search params, and to the constructor we have to pass in an object, and whatever query strings we want to be attached, we have to provide within this object as a key value pair. So the first query variable is going to be, and first and only, is called logout, and its value should be set to true. What this will do is this will make a variable named logout made available in the $_get global variable at the PHP, and the server will check if that variable is present. So that means a logout request, otherwise it's a verification request, this one, the first one. So what this will do, this is going to create a query string, something like this. Let's say so this will create a URL like this. So this URL search param will attach these attributes as a query string like that, and anything which is appended in the query string is going to be made available in $_get global variable at PHP. So let's remove. Now let's go back to login.php. Let's copy this one, and on top of this we have to put this one, and we have to append another attribute which is $_get, and the variable name is logout. So if the request method is get, and we have another variable set which is $_get logout, that means it's a request to be actually logged out. Since this one has two attributes or two conditions to be checked, so this one should come before this second one. Otherwise this second one will always take precedence, because it's checking only whether the request method is get or not. So this will be executed all the time. So we don't want that to happen. First of all, we want to check if this is a logout request or not. If that is the case, only this part should be executed. Otherwise, the second statement should be checked and executed if the if statement is true. So in that case, let's remove this. Let's remove else part as well. And we need to basically unset the session variables and then destroy the session. So we have two session variables, this session email and session logged in. $_ session email. We have to pass it to unset function, copy, paste, and unset logged in. Now session underscore destroy, and then send the message, success message. So let's go back to dashboard.html. If the data.status success, then redirect to frontend.html. Now let's give it a try. So we need to, since it's an object, so we need to remove those quotations. Now let's give it a try. Refresh. Okay, let's the digital NJ OTP 623. So status is success, so we should log out and redirect it to index.html. So it should be if status equals success. I don't know when did I change this. Okay, so let's try one more time. We are logged out and we are trying to access dashboard. So we again got redirected back to the index.html page. Now let's log in. 2344. Now log out and we got redirected back to the index.html. So that's the end of our tutorial. I hope you liked it. If you want to keep watching tutorials like these, please do like, subscribe, share and comment. Thank you so much.